Very welcome to one of the student webinars that we're having this week for adult literacy students, and this one is on climate change. And Margaret Murray is my name. I'm from the National Adult Literacy Agency, and we're delighted to have Paula Tiller here, who is a tutor in Kerry ETB and also a climate ambassador. So Paula is going to take us through a number of slides. It'll be for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we can take some questions. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, Paula's fine with that, aren't you, Paula?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's two ways to ask questions. One is that see the orange button at the top of your screen. If you, below that, there's a little hand symbol, and you can click on that hand symbol and I will see your hand being raised, and then I'll know that you want to ask a question. So I'll unmute you at that point. All the attendees coming are muted when you come in, and but we can unmute you to ask a question. And the other way of asking a question is if you click on the orange arrow and look down, there's a section called questions, and on the right hand side of that, where it says questions, there's a square with an arrow going through it diagonally, and if you click on the arrow there, click on that box, it'll open up the questions and you can type in a question there. And just to let you know that we are recording this webinar. We know a lot of adult literacy students might have difficulty getting onto a webinar, but would be able to use YouTube. So after we've had this webinar, people will be able to look at the webinar and listen through to what Paula is saying in her presentation. So that's another kind of, hopefully people will find that as a good resource. So Paula, we're delighted to have you, and I will pass over to you now for your presentation, all right? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Hi everyone, and welcome to this climate change workshop. Just, you can see some pictures on the screen at the moment that may look a little bit odd, and these actually are representations of the change in temperature across various areas since 1850 in the top picture to 2018. So that's across the planet where the global temperatures have changed, and you can see from the blue to the reds and the dark reds, they're getting warmer and warmer. So the red represents warm. So the top one is the global temperatures, and then we have an area of our country in Africa called Eritrea, and you can see that's getting much warmer, right up to the deep reds. And then we have Ireland. So Ireland has gone through, it's quite patchy from 1901 to 2018, but we are also getting warmer with the odd cool spot as well. Okay, so I'll carry on. So weather and climate, what's the difference? The difference is that weather is describing what's happening in the atmosphere over a very short time. So the next few hours or days. So when you get your weather forecast from Met Éireann or wherever else you're getting your weather forecast from, you know that's a short-term weather thing. So it might be looking at the sunshine that's due, the temperatures that are going to be around, how much wind there's going to be, how strong the wind's going to be, and precipitation. So precipitation is anything that's falling from the sky, so rain, hail, or snow. So that's weather. And when we talk about climate, climate is slightly different. So climate is the long-term trends of weather. So the average weather that you'd expect to find over a long period of time. And the globe, the world, the planet is divided into different climate zones. So you can see these blue areas at the top and bottom of the globe here are polar and subpolar zones. So that means they're quite cold regions. Then we have the temperate zone, and we are in the temperate zone. You can see Ireland there. And most of Europe is in the temperate zone, as well as North America. Most of North America, Canada, sorry. And then you've got the subtropical zone, which is parts of America, parts of Southern Europe and Northern Africa, and then further down to the parts of South America and Africa, South Africa here, and Southern Australia. And then you have the tropical zone. So this is the hottest area. And you can see Africa here, South America, India, and Northern Australia, and various parts of countries in Asia here. So those are the trends over a long period of time. So we'd expect certain areas of the planet to be hotter than other areas. Okay, what's pollution? So I'm just really going through a glossary of climate change terms that you might have heard at the moment. So really going to explain those words. So pollution is damage caused to water, air, or land by harmful substances or waste. And I'll talk about why I'm talking about pollution in just a moment. So pollution is one of the major factors that causes the greenhouse effect. So you may have heard of the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is basically when the gases in the atmosphere form a blanket around the Earth. So the sun's rays pass through the atmosphere. Here's our atmosphere. And then some of the rays bounce back off the planet and go back into Earth. So sorry, back into space. So that's allowing the Earth to cool. But some of them are trapped. And as they bounce back towards space, they're actually being bounced back from the atmosphere back down to Earth. And the reason they are being bounced back from the atmosphere is that around the atmosphere, we now have these greenhouse gases. So I'll talk about the greenhouse gases in a moment, but they're actually forming a blanket around the Earth and causing some of the rays from the sun to be trapped by the greenhouse gas blanket. So that's what's causing global warming and climate warming. So that's down to gases like carbon dioxide. That's one of the main gases that we know of. You might also have heard of methane, which is another big contributing factor towards the greenhouse effect. Okay. So what causes pollution? We have vehicles that cause pollution. These are some of the gases, by the way. Vehicles are one of the major causes of pollution. Power plants, so our demand for power and electricity. Household fires, believe it or not, they're a big contributor, and they also contribute towards this, which is particulate matter, and that's an important factor in global warming and climate change as well. We have factories contributing, crop burning, municipal waste. So the reason, I'll come back to the reason that that's important. And we also have dust, so again, particulate matter. Municipal waste is our household waste. And that gives off gases because there are many gases that once they start to be broken down in a waste environment, become either toxic or they actually contribute to some of the greenhouse gases. Dust is important because it contributes towards this particulate matter. So dust can come from diesel and a variety of other areas of our daily industry. And dust and particulate matter is important because it colors the snow and ice in the polar ice caps and causes them to absorb more heat from the sun. Okay, so emissions are, we talked about greenhouse gases, and you may have heard the term emissions. And emissions are gases that add to the greenhouse effect. And what emissions do is they trap heat through those greenhouse gases, the blanket that we talked about. They trap the heat in the atmosphere and on the Earth. And they include CO2, which is carbon dioxide, and methane and other damaging gases. So where does CO2 come from? That comes from us burning fossil fuels. That's the primary area of where CO2 comes from. And methane comes from rotting vegetation. It also comes from the animals that we use for food. And actually 96% of the mammals on the planet are domestic animals, primarily used for food. which is a bit an interesting fact. So I talked about fossil fuels there.
Paula, can you say that again? Can you say that again about the animals?
Yeah, so 96% of the mammals on our planet are domesticated animals. So domesticated mammals. So only 4% of the mammals on the planet, apart from us, of course, are wild mammals.
Right. And you know, when you say mammals, is that's different to animals, is it? Mammals are one subset of animals. So right. we are mammals.
Feed their young.
They feed their young, isn't it? Mammals feed their young.
Yeah. So they feed their young on live milk. They feed their young on milk, and they give birth to live young. And they have hair on their bodies and breathe air. So even actually some of the animals that live in the sea, live in the ocean, are mammals. So whales and dolphins are mammals. And you may not think that they have hair on them, but actually if you look really, really closely, they have little hair pits on their, what we think of as their nose, but it's actually their mouth. So yeah, they're mammals as well, but only 4%. Okay, so we talked about fossil fuels there, and fossil fuels are sources of non-renewable energy. And fossil fuels come from the remains of living organisms, so all animals and plants that were buried millions of years ago. So that means they're a finite resource as well, and finite means that they won't last forever. So non-renewable, they won't last forever. And unfortunately, when we burn them, we are emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. So some of the fossil fuels that we use all the time are coal, gas, oil, and oil actually is used in so many areas of our lives as well. So oil goes into plastics and many areas of our lives. So fossil fuels are non-renewable and finite. Okay. We also have carbon sinks. That's a term that you might hear. And we've talked about emissions of CO2, but actually there are many areas of the planet that act as a sink for CO2. So they actually absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. So oceans absorb CO2, for example, due to the tiny microscopic animals that are in the oceans. Forests are very important for absorbing large amounts of carbon dioxide. And very importantly, when they take in carbon dioxide, their output, what they breathe out, if you like, is oxygen. So forests are really important to us for that reason. One of the best known forests, for which we call the lungs of the earth, is the Amazon rainforest, which itself at the moment is at a tipping point to becoming a savanna, which is actually a grassland rather than a rainforest. So that's very important. Now, grasslands also absorb CO2, but they don't absorb as much CO2 as forests do. So it's important to retain our original forests, our rainforests. Okay. Peat bogs. You may not know this, peat bogs are actually carbon sinks, and they're an important carbon sink. So one of the moves at the moment is to try and re-wet peat bogs, and Ireland is also hoping to re-wet some bogs. And you may have heard that people who have been employed by Bord na Móna for traditionally cutting bogs are now hoping, or there's a hope that they'll be redeployed to actually help re-wet bogs, which will mean that they can be much more effective as a carbon sink. If we continue to disturb peatlands, what happens is we're emitting more CO2 from those peatlands and contributing to climate change. And actually, this is a fact you may not be aware of. Your average peat briquette is about, I think it's 10 centimeters deep, roughly, and 1 millimeter of that peat briquette takes 900 years to lay down. So that's an interesting fact that you might not be aware of.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a big one, isn't it?
1
Yeah, so
million. 1 millimeter takes
900 years to go down. Yeah.
900 years. 1 millimeter.
Yeah. So once it's gone, really. We need to keep it there. Okay.
It's like Harvey Norman.
No, like Harvey Norman. Yeah, once it's gone. Absolutely. Yeah. So we all have a carbon footprint as well. And you may have heard that term, people talk about our carbon footprint. So the carbon footprint is the total amount of greenhouse gases that a person releases or causes to be released. So your carbon footprint relates to the amount you travel by car or by airplane. It can relate to the amount of fuel you burn in your home. It can relate how far you have to travel to work or for leisure. It can be the amount a family, a building, or an organization burns per year as well. So companies have carbon footprints, and you'll often hear companies talking about how they offset their carbon footprint. So carbon footprint is the amount of carbon we are causing to be burned, basically, or emitted, sorry. Okay. Oops, I meant to change that title. Okay, so this is just a look at how carbon emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, have changed over time. So this is 400,000 years ago. It goes back to 400,000 years ago. This is a graph from NASA. And it varies, as you can see, it's cyclical. So it does vary. And it varies. But since in the last while, we can see the carbon dioxide levels have increased dramatically. And since 1950, they've basically gone straight up, which is clearly is not sustainable. We cannot keep doing that. So we're now at, even though people, things have cut down due to COVID, we're still at a huge rate of CO2 levels. It hasn't actually decreased significantly, as you might expect. So we need to act. Okay, Irish greenhouse gases. Believe it or not, 4.9 million people in Ireland emit the same amount of greenhouse gases as the poorest 400 million people on the planet. So we may think that we're not emitting very much, but actually we're emitting far more than somebody who is being very badly affected by climate change already in countries such as Kenya or Eritrea, the country that we looked at on the first slide. Okay, so where are Ireland's emissions coming from? They're coming from various places. So they're coming from energy industries, well, sorry, not energy industries are going down, but they are still coming from energy industries. Transport is a big factor, but largely the biggest factor is our agriculture. So that's something we really do need to address. And although it's not a popular thing to have to address, but it is something that we need to look at and change the way we do agriculture. Which means that we have to look at alternatives to the way we're doing things. It's not to say there shouldn't be any animals in Ireland for food, but we do need to think about how we can cut down the emissions from animals. So animals give off methane. We talked about that being one of the greenhouse gases, and it's actually a more dramatic effect on global warming than CO2. So there are changes that need to be made there. Also, a lot of our animal product goes to other countries as exports, so that's something we need to bear in mind. Okay, so what are the effects of climate change? So I'm just going to go through some of them that you might have heard. So drought, you may have heard the term drought, and droughts are often accompanied by wildfires. So a drought is just a period of unusually dry weather that causes significant shortages of water. So you can see here we've got a reservoir or a lake that should have more water in it, and it's drying up. So yeah, so drought is an issue. And accompanying drier conditions, we get wildfires that burn out of control. And there have always been wildfires. For many, many thousands of years, there have been wildfires. However, and always been drought, in fact, but these things are becoming more frequent. So when we see trends that see a growing frequency of drought and wildfires, we know that there's an effect on global warming or climate change. Okay, melting and flooding are also effects of climate change. So we have melting ice, and it's not just polar ice caps, although you might be familiar with hearing about the polar ice caps melting. Greenland is also, it's a huge ice sheet over Greenland, and that's melting at a significant rate. Permafrost, which is ice that permanently stays in some of the Arctic or subarctic areas, is also melting. And importantly, glaciers are melting. That's very important because glaciers are melting in places, in countries in Africa, and where a lot of the water for those countries would come from the glaciers. And they're now looking at the glaciers actually melting so they won't exist anymore, which is going to be problematic for those countries and their water supply. So Kenya, for example, would have it's known as the Garden of Africa. Yeah, sorry, Margaret, you had a question. Did you?
Oh, sorry. Could you explain what permafrost is? What's
say
permafrost?
What permafrost is?
Yeah.
Permafrost is actually, well, in many countries, such as northern Russia and subarctic countries or Arctic, subarctic countries, you would get peatlands like our peatlands, but actually they're full of ice. So that's permafrost, and that ice never really melts. So it's ice that is locked into the earth, as it were, locked into the peat. And now what's happening is that permafrost is melting, and that's causing more emissions because the vegetation that was locked into the ice is now being exposed to the air and releasing gases, particularly methane. So it's a problem.
Thanks,
okay.
Yeah. I just remind people, if you do want to ask a question, you can put up your hand underneath the orange little arrow, or you can write in a question. If you click on the orange arrow, there's more options and you can put in a question there. Thanks. Sorry, Paula, to interrupt.
That's okay. So flooding is another aspect of melting, and also sea level rise, which we'll look at in a moment, and also unusual weather extremes. So flooding is when water is flowing or collecting over land that's normally quite dry, and flooding is increasing. So again, this is in Africa. There are many countries in Africa that have, over recent times, have experienced huge flooding. And they would have, there would be flooding on a relatively frequent basis, but it's increasing in frequency, and it's increasing in the amount of flooding there is and the amount of rainfall there is. And it's very problematic, especially when it's over land that's dry, because that land, it doesn't absorb the water very easily. Okay, and really sea level rise is also part of the reason for flooding. And warming oceans. So warming oceans cause more precipitation. Remember, I said that precipitation was anything that falls from the sky, so more rain, hail and snow. So sea level rise since 1880, the global sea level has risen by 20 centimetres. By 2100, it's projected to rise between another 30 centimetres to just over 1 metre. Okay, so and that's important because it means that coastal areas are more prone to flooding, or low-lying areas. And you can see this is after a storm surge in an area where it's taken over the land and taken away houses here. And the reason that happens, sea level rise isn't just due to the melting ice caps and the glaciers, although that is a factor. It's also because the oceans are warmer, and I've got a picture of a kettle here. And if you think about a kettle, if you overfill it, you fill it to the top, what happens to that kettle? It boils over. and you end up with water on your stove or wherever. So the same happens with the ocean. I'm not saying it boils, but as it warms due to greenhouse gases and due to climate change and global warming, the molecules, the bits that make up the water, actually expand and get larger. And so they're actually, it's increasing sea level rise for that reason as well. Okay. This is just a recent picture you may have heard of. So that's in the last annex, which has occurred and caused damage to roads, caused roads to collapse, caused houses to collapse into rivers. There's been huge mudslides, and unfortunately, at least 2 people are known to have lost their lives, and there's still several people missing. So our weather extremes, again, are happening. They've always happened, but they're happening more frequently. And they had record amounts of rain in the mountainous areas of France and Spain during that storm. Desertification is another term that you may have heard of, and this is where land changes into desert. So it's down to continuous dry conditions, and they dry out the soil and make it easier to be damaged. So what happens is that erodes, the soil gets eroded, and that means that that's causing the desertification. Okay. All of these factors have effects, and one of those effects is food insecurity. And that means that because of elements like desertification and so on, that a place may not be able to, a place or a country might not be able to produce enough food to feed its population. And that's all down to drought, flooding and desertification. So you can see these darker areas on the map here. These are all areas that are the most prone to food insecurity. So you can see a lot of countries in Africa are prone, several countries in Asia and in South America. So really the Northern Hemisphere is okay, relatively okay in terms of being able to produce food for its population, but the Southern Hemisphere is going to have problems. Okay, so how might climate change affect Ireland? It's already having an effect in different parts of the world, as we've mentioned, but it's likely for Ireland that we'll see an increase in severe weather events. So we're going to have more storms, and you're probably already aware of that. We seem to have lots of dramatic storms over recent years, which means more flooding. We'll have hotter, drier summers, which may lead to a relative drought for us here, and colder, wetter winters. Oops, sorry now. Okay, so every country around the world is feeling the impact of climate change, but some people are feeling it more than others. So this photograph here is the destruction that was caused by a typhoon in the Philippines in 2013. There's actually been another very destructive typhoon since then. And again, this is down to storms becoming more frequent and actually more damaging as well. So the storms are becoming stronger due to global warming. We think about the effects of climate change and which countries are being the most affected, and we saw the food insecurity map there. It's interesting to think about which countries have the biggest carbon footprints. So, and which countries have the smallest. So if we think about which nations have the biggest carbon footprint, this is a foot in case you didn't recognize it, we can see that China, India, Japan, United States all have enormous carbon footprints, okay? So some of the countries with the smallest carbon footprints are, well, we've got Belize, Costa Rica. Actually, Costa Rica, I think, is entirely carbon neutral or minus carbon now. Mexico is relatively small, Haiti, Jamaica, lots of countries in Africa as well. So if you look here, you see the African countries, and they're barely represented on this carbon footprint. Okay, so, and this is a visualization of which countries are most affected by climate change. So the darker red are those countries that are most affected, and you can see they are nearly all in Africa, with a few in South America and Asia. Okay. And actually, we're in the least at risk area in these green areas, but we have the biggest carbon footprint. So this leads us to think about climate justice, and is it fair that the countries who are emitting the most are causing problems for the countries who are emitting the least? I'm just going to show you a short video. Is that okay, Margaret? Okay.
That's perfect, yeah.
Yeah. Let's see if it loads now. Oh, it's actually gone. Can you see that? Can you see my screen still?
Yes, it's coming. Yeah, it looks like it's coming there. That's just loading up.
Yeah. Okay, there we are.
Here you go.
Sorry, it's taking so long. This actually doesn't look as though it's loading, so I'm going, oh yeah, there it goes.
Both my parents, my eldest brother, my sister-in-law, and my 3-year-old. I'm just a youth, I'm just standing here with my small voice to this big corporation.
Okay. Okay, so really it's just about, you know, we all have a responsibility to think about how our impacts are being felt. So as we said, some people are feeling it more than others. So this is flooding in Pakistan that affected over 18 million people and resulted in many deaths, many thousands of deaths, or 2,000, almost deaths of almost about 2,000 people. And again, Pakistan would have a monsoon season, but the flooding is made worse by global warming. And 150,000 deaths globally are currently linked to climate change every year. So what can you do? It's not all doom and gloom. But these are just some simple measures that you can take. So don't waste food. And one of the ways to avoid wasting food is to plan your meals to avoid that. And you can think about what you can take over to the next day, when you could have leftovers for lunch and so on. Travel less, walk or cycle where possible. If you have the option to work at home, if you're working, then work at home. Eat less meat. It's not to say that you have to eat no meat at all, but if you can just even have one meat-free day, that will lower the emissions due to raising animals for meat. Eat locally produced food wherever possible. Try to avoid food with lots of air miles. And so you can use, there are farmers markets in many areas, and actually there's a growing number of community gardens and community food gardens, which is a great development. Turn off your electrics when they're not in use. So when you have devices that are on standby, like TVs and so on, if they've got a light on them, they're using electricity. So turn them off. Use LED lights. So LED lights are very low power, and the added benefit to that is that they're long lasting. So they're a great, they're good for your pocket as well. So use LED lights and switch to renewable energies if you can. So So if you know that there's a company that is offering electricity supply through renewables, switch to renewable energies. And don't burn peat and avoid burning other fossil fuels as well. So try and avoid burning coal. If you are going to have an open fire, because obviously everyone likes an open fire, but if you are going to have an open fire, probably wood, preferably locally grown and naturally fallen wood is the best option. And if possible, just grow your own food. It doesn't have to be a huge amount. Just there's a picture here of a small container gardening, so you can grow in very small areas. It doesn't have to be enormous. Things like cut and come again lettuce, some of your herbs. Kale is an easy thing to grow. So what's going on there?
Hey,
Sorry now.
how's everybody doing today?
Sorry about that. Okay, so climate change also creates an opportunity for change. So it can be full of negatives if we don't get involved and change things, or it can be very positive. If we go for renewable energies, we get less air pollution, which means that we can cut down diseases like asthma, pneumonia, heart attacks and stroke, all linked to air pollution. If we insulate our homes well, we can save lots of lives that are lost due to illness as a result of cold homes. We can grow local seasonal fruit and veg, which is better for us and better for the environment that we live in and our communities. Greener cities mean cleaner air. So if we can green our cities, we're also cleaning up our air. Community food forests, I mentioned community food gardens. We can, if we have more and more community forests, and this is growing through Africa as well, it means that we can get food from a variety of levels in a food forest area. So that's that would be a great initiative to take. And finally, we can make our voices heard. So we can protest basically and ask the government to make the changes that are needed to affect really effective climate policy and climate change policy. So all of the major cities around Ireland have seen Fridays for Future demonstrations. So this was one in Cork, this is Dublin, and this is actually a recent one in Limerick. And you can see there's no people, or very few people here, but there's actually 400 pairs of shoes. And those 400 pairs of shoes represent the people who would have been there except for COVID lockdown measures. And interestingly, COVID would be one of the diseases that could very possibly be linked to climate change as well. Okay, so it's your voice, make your voice heard, be part of the solution. That's it, thank you. Margaret, do you have any questions?
No, thank you very much, Paula. That was a great sweep through, you know, the topics. I thought the terms that we do here, but you might know what they really mean. Like, that was interesting to me now to get the difference in what permafrost is. I kind of had heard of that, but I didn't really know what it was. So good to see. I suppose the positive things you can do that. I suppose they do say if everybody cut down the meat by you know, by one day, as you said, which is sort of a gentle approach to it, that it would make a difference. So hopefully, and I suppose keeping it on the agenda as well when you're talking to politicians or other people, you know, about things that concern you. Mention climate change too. It kind of keeps it on the top of all our agendas, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's really important when, you know, especially coming up to elections, that you find out from politicians what they're doing to stop, to help, or to counteract climate change. What are the measures that they're taking? What do they stand for? It's very, very important. And it's very easy to get, you know, bogged down in sides. And it's important to look at the big picture. You know, it's not about getting rid of all cows or sheep or it's nothing like that. But it is about thinking, okay, should we be exporting so much meat? And is that the best way forward for us as a country?
And then looking at positive kind of alternatives of what, say, farmers in Ireland could do if they were supported.
Yeah, and I mean, there's been some tremendous successes with rewilding as well, and regenerative farming practices. So there's a book by Isabella Tree, I think it's called, and it's called Rewilding or Wild, and how they transformed their farm basically from being intensively farmed to rewilded, and it's been amazing for them. So, you know, it doesn't have to be negatives. It can be, there can be some real positives out of it by changing. But change is hard. You know, we have to lead into it, and we have to have the support of government. So that's
yes.
a big part. Yeah.
And I think there is a climate change bill, perhaps, or something going through the Dáil at the minute. Yeah, and we do have to hold the governments to account, because I think the last bill, or whatever, the last policy that was done maybe was not, didn't really have targets that were definite enough, and you know, people protested about that, and so hopefully, you know, they do have to, it has to be realistic and all that. So yeah, we have to keep it on the agenda, I suppose, to make sure that happens. Come here, I'm kind of conscious, I'm going to unmute all the attendees, and you won't come on automatically, but if you press, then you will get the opportunity to speak, just in case you'd like to ask a question. So from my end, I'm just unmuting you there. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you can speak. But Paula, thank you very much for a very informative presentation. I think it covered a lot between, and kind of covered that global view of it as well, you know. And I think another thing I picked up is, you know, it's not affecting us all in the same way, and relatively we're quite safe in Ireland compared to some other countries that are really experiencing it quite traumatically. I think we've probably all seen things on telly that would, you know, be quite frightening. Even this week, I think there was, as you had, I don't know if that photo was from this week, but it might have been from this week. Yeah, that was quite frightening. Like, you could see live footage of a house kind of going into the water, which is, I found, you know, frightening. So thank you for, I think it's good to bring it to people's attention. We'll be putting this webinar on YouTube, so it'll be available for centres where they maybe want to show the webinar and then have a discussion afterwards of that. So hopefully that'll be useful for adult literacy centres or other places where literacy is going on. So I'd just like to thank you, Paula, and all the attendees as well for joining us. And just to remind you, we have a few more webinars. We've one on tomorrow and one on Friday if you'd like to join us. Tomorrow is about visiting the doctor and just picking up some tips so that you get the most out of your visit with the doctor. And then on Friday, it's shopping and everyday maths, and looking at kind of percentages, how do you work out bargains as well. So hopefully they will be of interest to people. Yeah, so I don't know if anybody has any comments they'd like to share with us about what they've just heard or anything. I'll just give you a minute there. Paul, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Just really that people can be part of the solution, and yeah, and make their local representatives account for being part of the solution as well. So yeah, I think don't feel overwhelmed. I think there's huge strength in numbers.
And I suppose another thing to do is just keep conversations about it, you know, so you can try and figure out and find out more about it, and you know, I'm sure there's some resource books as well. Nala produced a plain English guide with the Department of the Environment at the time. It was about 2009. But what I've heard is that that's going to be updated soon by the department. So that's good, you know. And if Nala hears any more wind about that, we will be letting people know, you know, if that comes out again, a fresh kind of, because the terms do change sometimes as well. There's new terms or new pieces of information that are relevant. So we'll try and keep our members up to date with that if there's any developments there.
I guess one more thing I would say, Margaret, is that it's really important that people think about where they're getting their information from as well. So, you know, there's a lot of news coming at us all the time from various areas. So if you see something on social media, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's fact. So make sure that you do fact check as much as possible and get a whole variety of news. Find your sources from a whole variety of sources, not just, don't go for just one source.
Yeah, check out things a little bit further.
Yeah, exactly.
You did a webinar for us, or a workshop at the first student day in Cork. So that was great to have you doing that. And I think you were saying that there was kind of, that the climate deniers, the people who were sort of saying that this wasn't maybe happening so much, that can be out there, you know, amongst people where, you know, people have heard it's not really true. It's sort of, but I think it's kind of, when so many scientists as well say it's there, it's and when you can see it, evidence there, it's hard to kind of ignore it in a way, isn't it?
It is, and you really have to think about what are the interests of saying that it's not true, and who benefits from saying it's not true.
Yeah.
But
all right,
yeah,
listen, Paula.
So.
Sorry?
97% of scientists, I think it is, behind.
Yeah. Well, listen, Paula, just to say thanks again, and thank you to our attendees for joining us. And we will be putting this webinar up on YouTube, so hopefully other people get a chance to look at it then. And I'm going to say goodbye. So, and thanks again, everybody. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.